So we're going to switch gears here a little bit over the next few weeks. So far this semester we've been talking about different types of lawsuits that could potentially impact us as K&R practitioners. Now we're going to switch gears and look at not just a specific legal issue like we have been doing, but rather a strategy for how we might actually avoid or prevent those lawsuits from impacting us and our organizations. So instead of looking at actual legal issues as we have been doing, we're going to look at this from a different perspective and think about how we can actually prevent those lawsuits from ever rising. So our objectives for this unit are really to identify and define this concept of risk management, talk a little bit about why it's important, talk about the different areas of risk that we might look at in our field, and then finally look at this process of managing risk. So we've got an actual model that we'll look at that's basically a step-by-step guide for how we can manage risk within our organizations. And ultimately that's the process that you'll actually apply at your own sites for your risk management assessment. Okay. Let's go ahead then and define this concept of risk management. So you can see there we've got our textbook definition, which says that risk management is this process by which an organization identifies and manages risks of liability. Pretty straightforward, right? Ultimately, what we're talking about when we're talking about risk management is this idea of loss prevention, right? We want to take steps or actions that minimize loss for our organization. Your book talks about having this positive risk management attitude, right? Making sure that we are openly looking for and then acting upon any risks that we find within our organization. There's definitely this idea that, well, if we have an insurance policy, maybe it doesn't matter if we think about risk, we're covered. But as you can see here, there are a lot of different categories of loss that impact us as K&R practitioners. It's not just about money, although certainly money is one of those categories of loss if we're involved in a lawsuit in terms of the monetary damages we might have to pay out. But the loss goes well beyond monetary, right? We know that in any lawsuit, there's going to be a ton of time and effort spent toward fighting that lawsuit, right? We also know it could cause stress on our organization and the people that we work with. Never good. And we know that having a lawsuit against us can really tarnish or harm our public image, so our goodwill with customers and our members. So, when we think about risk management, we're not just managing risk so that we can avoid paying out damages. Certainly that is one of the categories we're interested in, but there are all these other categories of loss that we're also trying to prevent. Okay, who manages risk? I think this is a fair question, and I think at the end of the day, the answer will probably be individual based on the company you work for. But as you've read, and I think this is my take as well, it's really up to everyone within an organization to effectively manage risk. So it can't just be on the corporate entity, it can't just be on that manager or supervisor level, and it certainly can't just be the frontline staff. Everyone who works in an organization needs to buy into this idea of managing risk. And if you don't have that buy-in across the hierarchy, it's going to be difficult to have a functioning risk management program. Now, it is possible to bring in outside folks to this risk management process. Oftentimes, if an organization has enough resources, they will bring in a lawyer or actually hire someone to totally focus on risk management within their organization. Those of you who've interned or worked for a rec or sport organization probably know that those resources aren't always there. So to be able to hire someone specifically to manage risk is certainly a luxury that a lot of organizations in our field don't have. But if you can do it, great. Obviously that person has a particular expertise and can help you assess risk. Occasionally, what we will see is a rec or sport organization hire an outside auditor. So this is like a contractual work assignment. You're hiring someone to come in maybe once or twice, do a walkthrough of your organization, and then provide a report, a risk management report. The cost here wouldn't be quite as much as hiring a permanent risk manager or lawyer, but can also be really helpful to have an outsider's perspective when managing risk. Your book talks about this in quite a bit of detail, but This idea that, as we work at an organization day in and day out, we might not see things as clearly that are becoming risks. And someone with an outside perspective might be able to notice things that we don't notice because we are there every day. Here's an example of a sport organization hiring an outside auditor to assess risk. So in Los Angeles, this is where the Rams owner is building a new stadium. And this is a few years ago, but prior to actually starting construction on this new stadium, the owners hired a firm along with the city to actually assess any security risks that might exist for the stadium, because the location of the stadium is actually right near the airport in Los Angeles. So there were concerns that this could be a potential security risk for the facility and for the patrons of that facility. So rather than just saying, hey, we'll conduct our own risk management assessment, the team and partner with the city actually hired a security firm to come in and assess that risk. Of course, a team owner and the city have resources that a lot of our organizations don't necessarily have, but this is an example of a situation where they did hire an outside auditor to assess risk. Okay, so I mentioned at the top of the lesson that there are steps or a process to managing risk. And your textbook identifies one of these models, right? One of these risk management models. If you Google it, you'll see that there are a ton of different ways of approaching risk management. I like this one that your textbook uses, so this is the one we're going to focus on and apply to your risk management assessment. I think if you look through different models, you'll find that they all have a lot of similarities. They're just verbalizing things a little bit differently. But ultimately, this risk management process or cycle is something that is circular, right? You can see that in the model here, that all risk management starts with this process of identifying risks. From there, there's a level of evaluation that occurs of those risks, and then specific treatment methods are determined. From there, actual action is taken, right? There's implementation of managing those risks that have been identified. And then you can see in this model, we go back to the beginning, right? So this process of risk management is not something you would start on a Monday and finish on a Friday, right? It's something that is continual and something that needs updating consistently in order to have effective risk management. Okay, so we're going to highlight the different stages or steps here in the risk management cycle. I'll try to give you examples as we go. So let's start with step one here. As we said, the first step in any risk management plan is risk identification. So actually acknowledging and identifying potential risks facing your organization. Now, before you actually identify specific risks, again, it's important to have management or corporate entity that acknowledges that risk management is an important component of doing business. Without that acknowledgement, it's going to be very difficult for you as a practitioner to conduct effective risk management. So it really does start at the top. Again, we said it's important for everyone to be involved in this process, but without upper management support providing, the actual resources to do this, whether that's financial or time, then it's very difficult to actually start the risk management process. So you can see here, that personal buy-in is really important. So being able to not just have buy-in at the top, but having it throughout your, work hierarchy and work structure. Again, back to this idea of positive risk management that your textbook talks about. So before we actually identify individual risks, it's really important that the corporate entity itself and the management levels actually acknowledge that this is an important thing that we look at as an organization. Okay, so where do we start when we think about identifying risks? Well, you might be thinking, wow, this seems like a really big process, and I don't even know where I would start when I think about my own place of employment. Well, there's a couple of things that you can look at, right off the bat to consider potential risks for your organization. But then there's some more specific categories that we'll look at here momentarily. But some ways that you can identify bigger risks for your organization is, look at the incident reports that have been coming out of your organization for the last year or so. What do those incident reports tell us? Are there some common themes coming out of that in terms of what's impacting our organization? Were these incidents occurring because we didn't have proper supervision of our programs? That might be something to consider as a potential risk. Of course, when it comes to identifying physical risks for our organization, we have to be conducting regular inspections of our actual premises, right? So the premises itself, the equipment that we have and that our patrons use, conducting those regular inspections is going to help us identify obvious known risks. Some other maybe not so straightforward ways to identify risk are to keep your eye out on what's happening in the industry, right? What are some other things that are happening at other organizations like ours that could potentially impact us? I like to use the example of the Me Too movement, right? And this light that's been shown on sexual harassment in the workplace. This is something that may not be impacting our organization right now, but we see that it's permeating other organizations, right? That perhaps we haven't done all that we can do to prevent these things from happening. So we see it happening outside our doors. Maybe we take some steps to mitigate that risk in our own doors. So that's something to think about when you think about industry standards and norms and things that are happening. Consider state and federal mandates. Of course, you want to stay up to date with the legal changes that are happening within your own state. That could identify some specific risks if you're not, obviously. And then finally, I tell students this all the time when they go out to conduct their risk management assessments. Oftentimes just use common sense, right? Take the knowledge that you have as a professional with experience in this field and then use common sense, right? If something seems wrong or like it could be a risk, it probably is, right? So use your common sense as you are identifying potential risks. Again, just as we said with the process of risk management, identifying risks can't just be a one-time thing, right? We have to be continually identifying potential risks for our organization. And again, changes occur all the time in our field, right? Whether it's new activities, new programs, new equipment, new staff, all of those changes can impact the types of risks that we identify. So it does have to be this continual process. Okay, so again, I mentioned earlier that there are some specific categories of risk that we can consider as we start this process of risk identification. So you can see I've outlined those here. I've taken some of the categories suggested from your book, but also added some of my own from prior readings. So I think this gives you a pretty exhaustive list of categories to consider as you are looking for risk. So the first two are those sort of obvious known risks, right? So you're assessing the actual premises and trying to identify any potential risks you see, whether it's actually related to the inside of your facility or maybe even the outside of your facility, from the parking lot to the front door to the entryway to the facility itself, right? So just an overall assessment of the premises and identifying potential risks that might be present. So I'm using the ISU High Ropes course as an example to sort of shape our conversation here around these categories. So if we were conducting a risk management assessment on this facility, certainly we would want to make sure we're doing a walkthrough of the parking lot, the actual indoor facility where the front desk is, where the locker rooms are, where the meeting spaces are. We want to check all of that out, the outside pavilion there. And of course, we want to also assess the ropes course itself as being part of the premises. So we'd want to make sure that we're doing a thorough walkthrough of the facility to identify any premises risks. The second category of risk, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? We're looking for any risks associated with the equipment that we have at our facility. Again, this is going to be individual to each organization, right? place like a fitness center is going to have a lot more equipment that the patrons engage in than, say, like a minor league sports team, right? So keep in mind that the type of equipment you're assessing and how much of it is going to vary based on the type of organization you're in. So if we are assessing risk at the ISU High Ropes course, there's some obvious equipment we want to look at, right? So we want to make sure that we're assessing some of the equipment on the actual course, making sure it's all up to standard and in good shape. And then we want to assess any of the equipment that's going to be used by the folks using the course, right? So anything from helmets to the actual ropes to the actual hooks and everything else that goes into that process. So we'd want to assess any and all of that equipment, make sure that it is meeting the standards of the field, making sure that it's in good shape and reliable. Okay, these next two categories kind of go together, but we'll take them one by one. So this first one having to do with staff is personnel, right? So those first two categories were pretty obvious physical-based risks, right? Well, these next two aren't necessarily quite as obvious. You might have to do a little bit more digging when it comes to identifying risks associated with personnel and supervision. So when we talk about personnel, if we think about ISU ropes course as an example, we'd want to make sure that the staff on site has proper certifications, right? Maybe there are certain climbing certifications that they need to have in order to work at that facility. We also want to make sure that they have any training necessary to work at that facility, whether that's initial training for using the course or even more HR related training like sexual harassment prevention. Do they have necessary training and certifications to be doing the job that they have? We also want to make sure they have the ability to provide emergency care, right? So maybe that's they're trained on the AED at the site. Maybe it's that they had emergency training when they first started at the site. Basically, we want to make sure that there are no risks associated with our personnel and their ability to do their job. So you would want to look a little bit deeper, obviously, here to see what kind of certifications and what kind of training folks have at these sites. Okay, the second one having to do with personnel relates more to the actual supervision and instruction that's provided by your staff. And often this is going to fall in that lower category of employees, right? This entry-level folks that are your front of line, right? These are the people working with clients, members, patrons on a regular basis. And here we want to make sure that they're providing adequate and proper supervision, right? We want to make sure that they have looked at the type of activity that they are supervising and made the correct determination in terms of what kind of supervision that should provide and then how many supervisors are needed. So making sure that we're providing adequate supervision for the activities that we're putting on. So at the ISU High Ropes course, of course, we'd want to consider the size of group that we have, whether or not they're novice or experts in terms of their climbing ability, their adventure course ability, and then making sure we have not just the correct number of supervisors, but they're able to provide adequate supervision. And we would probably consider this to be fairly high-risk activity. So, of course, we'd want to provide more specific supervision rather than more general supervision. Okay, our last category here of risk identification is documentation. So basically, will the documentation that we have in place protect us in the event that we are sued? So as we think about sort of some of the already documentation that we've talked about in here, that could be a waiver, right? We've talked about waivers, we've talked about agreements to participate. Are those well written? Are they going to be considered valid by a lawyer if we are to be sued for something like negligence? So that would be one place to start, identifying the waiver, doing a read through, making sure that it meets those requirements that we discussed. There are other documents that we'd want to assess when we're assessing risk. So maybe reviewing the emergency guide that is on hand at a site. Is it thorough? Is it covering all that it needs to cover? Is it informative? Is it something that's accessible to staff? And there could be other documentation you look at depending on the site, right? Perhaps like a campus recreation setting, like the high ropes course is probably going to have something like an accident form, right? That's filled out in the event that there's an accident. Is that form well written? Does it collect enough data so that we could potentially use that incident form to make improvements down the road, or potentially even support our side of an incident if a case goes to a lawsuit? So basically just wanting to collect all the documentation that the site uses that is an interaction between them and their employees, or them and their patrons. We want to make sure that that is all well written in a way that could protect us potentially in the event of a lawsuit. Here's just a couple of other documents you might consider. Again, all of this is specific to the type of organization you have. Certainly if you are working more on the event side of things or tourism side of things, you're going to deal a lot more with contracts like lease agreements, rental agreements. Those are legal documents that you certainly want to ensure are well written and covering all that needs to be covered and can protect you in the event that there is some kind of dispute. Okay, so those are our 5 categories of risk identification. Again, when you think about going into an organization blind and trying to assess risk, it could be an overwhelming process. So I always tell students, when you go in to assess risk or identify potential risks, use this as a guide, right? Think about these 5 categories of risk and go from there rather than just starting from scratch. Maybe start big with premises liability, doing a walkthrough, and then go down from there, right? Then focus on the equipment. Maybe then you have some conversations with the staff about their training, their certifications. Then you maybe, watch and review the supervision that's occurring within the various programs. And then finally, you ask for documentation, and then you can take that home later and assess it. So really, you can sort of start big and go small here when it comes to this risk identification process. Certainly, you could do it other ways as well. I just find that this is a helpful tool in making sure you don't miss anything along the way. Okay, I just gave you an example here of an actual risk identification might look like. So I gave you the example of a Park District basketball tournament, and then I identified 4 risks at that tournament. So this gives you an idea of how you might actually word risks that you're identifying. And you can see you want to be detailed, but not too detailed, right? You want to basically provide a synopsis of what the risk is. And you can go into more detail, certainly, than this in your actual report, but it's good to have sort of a summary of the risks that you're identifying along the way. That could be helpful for some other things we're going to do later on in the process. I'm not going to read through all of those risks identified, but take a few minutes, read through those. Think about how the different categories of risks that I identified are represented here in the potential risks. Okay, one last note on the slide as well. Keep in mind that not all risks are going to be obvious physical harms, right? So the last one in particular, incident involving sexual harassment, right? That might not actually involve physical harm, but it could involve emotional harm and trauma. And so keep in mind that not all risks that we identify might be obvious and physical in nature. The same is true with the vandalism to the arena, right? No one is actually being physically harmed there, but the property is being harmed. There's loss monetarily from that vandalism. So keep in mind that not all risks are going to be physical harm. Okay, so step 2 of our risk management process is evaluation. So we've collected this list of potential risks for our organization. Now we need to evaluate those risks. So what does that mean? Well, basically we want to go through this process of classifying risk based on 2 things. Frequency of risk, so how often these risks are likely to impact our organization, and then severity of risk. How severe are these risks potentially? And so we do that for a couple of reasons. One, it helps us organize this laundry list of risks that we've identified, right? So we can sort of go through this process of assessing or evaluating them based on frequency and severity. And then from there, we can take our rankings, essentially, and prioritize which risks we're going to deal with first as an organization. Because unfortunately, as you'll find as you get into this field more, we don't have the resources to fix everything, right? That's generally true of most kinesiology and recreation sites. So we have to be able to prioritize, right? What are the most concerning risks that we have? Which risks are most frequent and most severe? That's where we want to start, right? That's where we want to prioritize. Which risks are most likely to cause the most harm and the most often? We start there and then we work our way back. So this process of evaluation helps us get organized. It helps us prioritize. So how do you go about evaluating risks based on these criteria? Well, I will say that it's not a completely objective process. So it's not always going to be obvious to you whether or not a risk is likely to occur frequently or occasionally, right? So keep in mind that there's not necessarily a perfect answer here. You are making these judgments based on your knowledge of the facility and your history with the facility, right? So being aware of what's going on internally is helpful in classifying or evaluating risks. It's also important to consider industry standards, right? As we mentioned earlier, you want to stay up to date with what's happening in the field, what standards have changed, and how might that impact how we classify these risks. We'll talk about it here in a few minutes, but Major League Baseball has shifted some things here recently in terms of their netting, right? Because they have noticed that there are a growing number of balls and bats hitting fans in the stands. So because of that and because of increased lawsuits from that to teams, this kind of risk is now becoming more frequent and more severe for teams. So thinking about what's happening in the industry, what current legal issues are we facing, that can help you classify the risks beyond just your basic understanding of what happens in the history of the facility, although that's important too. Okay, so one way that we can actually prioritize our risks after we have ranked them in terms of frequency and severity is by using what we call a summary matrix. So this is a really handy chart that we can use to actually visualize the risks in our organization, and then from there we can actually prioritize which risks we're going to attack or treat first. So this chart is actually something that you would utilize after you have ranked frequency and severity of risk. And then once you've done that, you can see you simply plug these risks into the chart. And once you have several risks there, you can sort of start from that top left-hand corner and work your way down to the far lower right-hand corner. Because of course we want to start with the severe risks that are happening most frequently, and then those risks that are slight and only happening rarely aren't something that we need to prioritize. Maybe that's something we can wait until next year to address, right? So this summary matrix gives us the ability to, one, organize those risks once we've evaluated them, and then from there prioritize on our actual treatment methods. Here's some other considerations you might want to look at when you're actually evaluating risks. So of course you want to think about the participants involved, both their skill level and their physical condition. How might that impact the level of risk involved? What's your ability to supervise these programs or events? That's certainly going to impact level of risk, and so on and so forth. Your book does a nice job of going into detail on these considerations, so I'll let you do that reading to go into a bit more detail. Just keep in mind that, as you think about evaluating risk, there are a number of factors you want to take into consideration. Okay, I mentioned earlier that, one, I think, good example of industry standards changing has been this reaction to the Me Too movement, or this acknowledgement that, hey, we've got some issues here in terms of how organizations are handling sexual harassment, or rather not handling it, for several years. So on ReggieNet, I'm going to post an article talks about the IHRSA, so that's the International Health, Racquet, and Sports Club Association. basically they put out this guideline to fitness clubs last year, all about sexual harassment policies. So this is this association that a lot of fitness clubs look to as a guide point, basically saying, hey, here's some changes we need to make in order to mitigate this risk, right? In order to make sure this isn't something that permeates our field. So this is a great example of an industry identifying a current legal issue and then providing some standards or taking some steps to minimize it. So I'll post that to ReggieNet so you can take a look.